Hello! In this video I'm going to talk about the rubric that I'm going to be using to grade your papers. So there are four categories in this rubric. There's a writing category, an organization category, an exposition category, and a critique category. And I'll go through these in order. So writing. This writing has to do with individual sentences. How many sentences had to be reread because of writing? And if the answer is almost none, the paper gets an A. In the writing category. If there's a few, then it's going to be a B, and if there are many, then it's going to be a C. What makes a paper easy to read? Well, we're going to look at some examples, but I'll talk in general about what makes it easy to read right now. So we want easy to read, so short, clear sentences. So you might have the sense that, like I need to write big, fancy, complex sentences, and that for this class, no. This is sort of like a just the facts class in a sense. Even though it's philosophy, precisely because it's philosophy, we want to try to make it as simple as possible. As you know, some of the reasoning for this course has been not easy, right? If you ask yourself, why was it not easy? Part of the reason is that the sentences are, in some cases, are really big and complex and long. So don't do that. We want try to write short sentences, grammatically simple sentences, with simple word choice. So in other courses, you may be told to vary your sentence structure or to vary your word choice. Do not do that in this course. We want to use, once you've chosen your terms like God or organization, order with a goal or whatever, stick with those terms and do not change sentence structure or terminology just for variation. Keep it simple, keep it easy, which means short, simple sentences that don't have lots of different structures and don't change the words around. We don't want recurring grammatical errors. Your browser or your word processor, whatever you're writing in, will have a grammar check, so you can use that. Also, same with spelling errors. You want to minimize the abstract terms that you use. Keep the terminologies down to earth as possible. When you do use abstract terms, say what they mean. And you don't want to write in a conversational tone, so don't use contractions like don't and so on. And if you're confused about that, just let me know, and I can talk to you about that in more detail. So those are the things that contribute to easy to read sentences. The second aspect of the grading is organization. So here the question is not so much any given individual sentence, but rather how, when you're reading along and you read a given sentence, can you tell how does that relate to what has come before and the overall structure of the paper? How does this one sentence I'm reading fit into the big picture of the paper? So what's going to make it easy to know how a given sentence fits into the big structure of the paper? Well, we'll have an introduction that outlines. And so if we're almost never lost when reading your paper, then the paper gets an A. If there's several times when the reader would be lost, then it's a B. And if the reader is often lost, then it's a C. And lost is how does it fit into the big picture of the paper? So the introduction, it helps if your first paragraph says here's the topic, but then also says here are what the different parts of the paper are going to be. So I'm going to state this argument. I'm going to tell you sort of what the different terms in it means and what the premises mean, and then I'm going to defend them as the author would defend them, the author of the argument would defend them, and then I'm going to criticize one of them. So you just say all that in the beginning of this paper. And it's pretty easy in this case. If you're writing a 15, 20, 25 page paper, which you will do in some of your classes at some point, but not in this class, then the paper is going to have a pretty complex structure, and that makes it all the more important to be clear about it. Here, this is actually pretty straightforward to do, but you still want to do it to make it clear to your reader what the organization of the paper is. And then each paragraph should have an obvious point. It should be obvious what the paragraph is doing. Is it explaining one of the premises? Is it explaining one of the terms? Is it explaining why one of the premises is true? Is it criticizing one of the premises? Is it explaining what the conclusion says? What is that one paragraph doing? And it should be clear and easy to find out what that paragraph is doing. And then there should be clear transition between paragraphs. So when you go from when the reader goes from one paragraph to another, well, okay, what's happening now? How does what's happening now relate to the previous paragraphs? And that can be very straightforward. First, well, so now let's talk about the next premise, and so on. Or now I've explained what the terms are. Now I'm going to tell you how what the whole premise means. And if, to the extent that the paper doesn't do those things, the paper is going to be hard to follow. So the more you do this, the better. The less the paper does this, the harder it is, the easier it's going to be lost in reading the paper, and that's not what we want. So these 4 categories are all weighted the same, but in a way the writing and the organization are the most important, because I can only grade what I can understand. And in terms of, so the exposition asks, how accurately does the paper describe the argument being discussed? Well, if it's hard to figure out what the argument, what the paper is saying about the argument, then this is going to be then the exposition is going to be hard to do. And same for the criticism. So to get a good grade on these parts of the paper need to be good. It's rare for the grades in exposition and critique to be better than the writing and organization parts. The exposition asks, how accurately does the paper describe the argument being discussed? So if the paper accurately presents, Hume's argument or Bailey's argument, whatever, it's an A. If there are small errors that don't really, in and of themselves, make a huge difference, but that could be maybe lead to a significant misunderstanding, that it's a C, or it's a B, excuse me. If there are big errors in the presentation of the argument, then it would be a C. And then the last part is the critique. And again, the critique is only really going to be good if the exposition is good. If the exposition is off, if the exposition mistakes what the argument says, then your critique isn't going to probably engage with what the argument actually says, and so it's not going to be successful. And here, you don't actually need to say, like, I have successfully shown that Hume's argument fails. Maybe you will do that. What you really need to do for this paper is say, be very clear about what the target of your criticism is, so in particular which premise, and then say, like, well, here's the concern that I have about that premise, why I think that premise is false or might be false, and just you don't need to overstate it. Just say, here's why I doubt that, or here's why I'm convinced that it's false. Your degree of certainty, it doesn't matter how certain you are. It matters that you clearly communicate how certain that you are. You don't have to be certain. You don't have to pretend to be certain. You don't have to be uncertain or pretend to be uncertain. Just sort of, you need to say, here's a problem or potential problem, and here's why I think I'm certain it's a problem, or I'm sort of certain it's a problem. Okay, so those are the 4 categories. How easy are the individual sentences to read? How's the overall organization of the paper? So as the reader's moving through the paper, can they tell how the given sentence that they're at, whether or not it's easy to read, given that they figured out what it means, how it fits into the overall structure of the paper and what's happening overall in the paper? And then the exposition, how accurately does the paper describe the argument being discussed? And the critique, how effective is your criticism of the argument? And in particular, to what extent does your criticism do what you actually say it does in the paper? So those are the 4 parts of the rubric. In the other 2 videos in this module, I'm going to apply this rubric to 2 example papers. And then for your assignment, you're going to apply the rubric to 2 other papers and say how you think it does on some of these categories.